Greetings, I'm Justin Rothshank, and I'm here to invite you to join me and 30 other potters from around the country for the 10th annual Michiana Pottery Tour, happening on September 25 and 26 in northern Indiana and southern Michigan. You'll find a list of participating potters, links to their web stores, and more information at www.michianapotterytour.com or on our Instagram page at Michiana Pottery Tour. We hope to see you at the 10th annual Michiana Pottery Tour.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 385 of the podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm talking to Daniel Gillberg. He is a Swedish potter, but is based in Norway. In this interview, we talk about his career in clay, as well as his side parallel career as a paper restoration expert. In this interview, we talk about techniques for paper restoration, as well as what it's like to hold a European masterwork and even dunk them in water to fix some of the errors that have accumulated over hundreds of years of their existence. We also discuss how he develops pattern-based surface design and standalone images for his ceramic vessels, which is what you can see if you go to his website. That's danieljillberg.com. You can also follow him on Instagram at d.gillberg. Before we get to that interview, I also wanted to thank the folks that have recently donated to our podcast. We are listener-supported, so I'd like to thank Zachary Wallert, Wendy Kershaw, and Caitlin Nicholson for their contributions. If you'd like to get involved yourself, you can do so at the website. That's talesofaredclayrambler.com/donate. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Let's start talking about conservation, how you got into that field. Like, as a young child, were you like, I think I'm going to learn how to preserve old artworks?
Well, it kind of happened like a sort of like a compromise, really. Before that, as long as I can remember, I was always doing art. Like, I was always painting or drawing, or, my grandmother used to paint and draw, and she painted on porcelain, and she painted oil on canvas, and she was like, so I was always doing that. And and after I made my way to through school, and then I started studying glass and ceramics. But when I was kind of halfway through, more than halfway through, I became quite ill. And so I couldn't really finish the last semester. So I just had to move back home and kind of just take a time out and reroute everything. And it took a while, maybe a year or so, before I kind of started emerging again, getting my health back. And by that time I needed something to do. And I ended up doing like a little sort of an internship at the local museum, or kind of the county museum where I come from in Sweden. And I was doing like bits and pieces of, I was working a little bit here and there in different departments and helping out, with moving objects and cataloging objects. And I made some small retouch projects and things like that. And there was this lady sitting in one of the rooms And every time I walked by, there was like music coming from her room, and she had this just kind of pile of scraps of paper. And every time I popped in, there was this imagery kind of emerging. Like she was literally putting all these tiny little pieces together again. It was this whole kind of painting on a thick paper. And I was like, that's kind of interesting. Since I kind of burned out studying glass and ceramics, I was thinking, maybe that's like an alternative. Like, it won't make me like a poor artist with no money working my butt off, because that was also something that people kept telling me, like, don't go back to ceramics, like you will be a poor artist and you will have to work, day and night, you will never have money. And so I kind of had that, unfortunately, well, maybe fortunately, I don't know, but I had that as well with me. I asked, what are you doing? Like, what's your game, lady? And she's like, I'm a paper conservator. I'd never heard of it before, but of course, I mean, there are conservators in all the museums, most of the museums, taking care of the collections. And and she told me about the school. There's one school in Sweden. It's at the University of Gothenburg, which is kind of down south on the west coast. Yeah, it just seemed very interesting to me, because it's this whole conservation is both about practical skills, but it's also about the whole theory and the physical aspects of materials. And so I was thinking that could probably be something for me. And so I took all my extra classes that I needed in chemistry and things and applied to school. And it was a whole long application like time. I had to send in, I had to make a 3-dimensional copy of a medieval instrument, and I had to write a thesis, and it was all these things. And and I got in, and that's how I ended up doing that. And paper, that was just kind of by coincidence, because like they had like this program that every 4th year, so when you're working with conservation as a conservator, you specialize in this particular material. So you'd be a painting conservator, or you'd be a wood conservator, or you'd be a metals conservator, or a paper conservator. And so every 4th year, or they changed the specialization was changed for every year. So it just by coincidence, I was paper that year, and I was like, yeah, I've done a lot of paper, like printing and drawing. Yeah, it might be interesting. So that's how I ended up with the paper business. And that was a very long and
no, that's fine. So when we learn to make clay, we make a lot of bad things and we just re-wedge the clay. But when you're doing paper conservation, like if you're working on an old artwork, you can't, like, how do you not stress out about messing it up?
Yes, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, you just have to take things you need to be very cool about things. Like, you need to take it very slow, and you do your little tests, and you take it, step by step. But I think also over time, because I mean, a paper can be so much. I mean, it can be historic wallpapers on site in some sort of palace or whatever. It can be old manuscripts, from BC. Like, it can be 3-dimensional objects. It can be paintings or prints or even photography. But I think like over time, you kind of build up this reference register of various materials, and the more you work, the better you become to kind of recognize and see the different problems. Like, you you will work on one object and then you will be like, but this reminds me of this other whatever Picasso print I was doing some work on. I remember that type of paper because this kind of behaves a little bit like that. And so you kind of follow that instinct or that reference, as well as kind of going step by step, like always try the minimal intervention first and then kind of, you dig deeper into the object. Yeah. But it's you can't really think about financial values or or cultural values, and I think I've become pretty damaged by that, because when I see an object, I usually see the material first. Like, this is, if I'm going through an exhibition at as a visitor at a museum or whatever, this is usually what I see even before maybe I see the motif or the actual image. So I'll be like, that's a spot there. Isn't that a tear? Like, what is isn't it very moist in here? Like, do they even like all these things? It can be exhausting sometimes, because sometimes I just want to enjoy the art, but it's just, my eyes are just trained to look for these things, like small things and details.
It's the ultimate problem solving, I would imagine, because when you get to the object or the piece of paper, let's say it's a manuscript, you have to diagnose what's the paper, what's the fix, like what are you going to do, and then how are you going to do it? So can you talk us through that? Can you just pick something that you've worked on recently and talk us through how you diagnosed what the material was and then what you needed to do to fix it?
Yeah, so I've recently been working on a bunch of Cézanne drawings. Well, maybe that's not on that, because that it wasn't so many interesting problems. But for instance, yes, I was working actually this week on an ink drawing by a Swedish 1800s artist, and it was on thin paper, and it had become very yellow and brownish, almost discolored over time. And that had to do with the fact that it was actually glued to another kind of thicker paper that was very acidic and yellow. And that paper was then adhered to like a cardboard or something, like a paper board. Paper becomes discolored or yellow because of degradation. Like when paper degrade, there's a byproduct that is chromophorus, that we say that. So it's coloring, it's discoloring, and that also makes the paper acidic. The more acidic the paper becomes, the faster the degradation goes, or it's kind of an accelerating process. And so ideally you want to remove like all the acidic material that is in contact with the object. Doing that, you usually need to somehow figure out how you can use water to wash things out of the paper, because water is the most soluble, it's the strongest polar solvent. But in order to put something in water or on top of water, or there are many methods of introducing water or moisture to an object, you also need to identify what's on the paper. What is the media, and how much moisture can that take before it starts to bleed, before it, a well-conserved object will not look treated or handled or anything. It can be a little bit, the best conservation treatment is the treatment that you can't see in a way. So yeah. So anyway, so I was I tested the ink and generally all types of inks are usually soluble and they can't take so much moisture, and you need to be very careful with them. You can't just plunk it into water, which you can do with, for instance, lithography, because that's printing ink that is oil-based. So oil and water kind of repels, so that if the paper is strong enough, you can put it in water or in other solutions. So I was thinking, well, step one is obviously to remove all the acidic materials. So with one of my scalpels, I use a lot of surgeon's knives, like proper scalpels. I had to cut out parts of the board to get the thin paper off, to remove it. But then there were like bits of cardboard hanging, still sticking to the thin paper wherever there were like adhesive. And then there's a tedious process of turning the object upside down and then layer by layer cut away the cardboard with the scalpel, like layer by layer by layer, until you reach the adhesive. And then if you're lucky, the adhesive will be soluble with maybe water or moisture, and then you can try to soften it a little bit with various gels, and so you can remove it without damaging the paper. But if the paper is very discolored, you have to watch out for making stains, because then you got another problem you have to take care of. Yeah, so it's a tedious work, like it takes time. Yeah, and then after removing all the cardboard and the adhesive, there was a lot of tears and some loose parts, like traditional classic damages, like corners falling off, and so see to that everything is there. And then there's a method of making kind of rigid water. It's like a rigid gel. You basically, it's like rigid water. It's a gel and gum cleaning gel, which I learned from some Italian colleagues. But with this process, you can, if you have a very delicate object that you need to treat with moisture or water, but you have to be very careful. You can make this gel, and then you put the object on top of the gel. And so the moisture from the gel will slowly soak into the object. And then you have like the capillary action of the gel that pulls out all of the degradation products and the discoloring. So you will end up with a slightly damp object and this clear gel, or it is clear when you start your treatment, but afterwards it might look almost like tea, because all the yellowing kind of extracts, or the gel extracts the discoloration, and it's a long process.
When you get paper wet, it expands and contracts when it dries. So how do you, the same with clay? I mean, I've never thought about how similar paper and clay are until you're describing this. And I'm like, this is it. In terms of physics, particles going together and water moving between them, it's pretty similar. But paper, when it dries, is going to wrinkle. Once you've done all your treatments and it's ready to do the final step of like drying it out, how do you do that without it being a problem?
Usually I let the object just air dry, because I don't want to add tension to it while it's drying, because as you say, it usually shrinks. So after a treatment like a wet treatment, I'll let it dry just in open air, and then I'll come back to it and introduce moisture again. But yeah, like very carefully. And different papers can need different amount of moisture to just kind of relax, but without expanding too much, and then I'll let it dry under pressure. See, a paper wrinkles because there's wet areas that expands, but you still have like dry spots. And so when those two areas meet, of course, the paper is getting larger where it takes on moisture, but it stays the same where it still is dry, So if you wet your entire paper, or if you introduce moisture to the whole object, you get an even, relaxed, nice material to work with. Yeah, but it's interesting how much some papers will expand quite a lot when they get wet, and some papers will expand really fast, and others you have to introduce maybe alcohols or other things to open up the surface so that the water will take on paper. But I mean, it's the same basics as like your skin. When you're in a tub, it becomes, your fingertips look like raisins suddenly, and that's because your skin is getting larger. You're actually, and this might sound a little disgusting, but you're actually absorbing, the water in your tub. The fibers in the paper that kind of sits like, if it's a machine-made paper, the fibers in your paper will sit like, if you can imagine, like just kind of like stripes, like parallel stripes like this, and the water molecules, the moisture, will link themselves between these kind of lines, the stripes, and push them apart. So the paper, if it's a machine-made paper, it usually expands more across the fiber length, and it expands less along the fiber length. So it's like, so there are all these things you need to think about.
You mentioned that you've learned from Italian colleagues, and I would imagine that there's not that many people that are doing conservation on this level. So do you guys have like a paper conservation conference or congress where everyone comes together and says, "Oh, I figured this out. Let me show you how to do this"?
Yeah. Usually there's like the European Society, there's the Scandinavian or Nordic Conservator Organization. There's the AIC, which is the American Institute for Conservation, and so and so. And I mean, here in Scandinavia, we are so very few. I mean, it's a very small area. We're not so crowded as you guys, so we're not so many here. But so we usually meet up once a year. There will be like a paper conservation meeting, or there will be Scandinavian meetings, and there's a lot of sharing across the countries, but usually people specializes in very like narrow, nerdy things. And so it's like, if I need to know more about, an old map, but it's like round on a thing,
a globe.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So if I want to know more about globe conservation, I'll contact this lady in London or the other colleague in Italy that specializes in this. Or if I'm working on I had this job when I was working on birch bark manuscripts from very, very early, they were very, very early Buddhist manuscripts. And so then I contact other people that have done similar work, and people are usually interested in, sharing knowledge. And this is a nice parallel also, I think, to the clay community. I think that clay people are always very friendly, and wherever you go, there's always a potter you can visit. They're two good worlds to be in.
I have one more paper question, and then we'll move on to clay. You mentioned, casually that you were working on Cézanne drawings, and I know you've worked with Picasso's work, you've worked with Edvard Munch collection. Like these are people that have defined how we think of art, or at least in Europe in that era. How is working on these objects define the way you think about art? Because you're touching the history and you're interacting with it like literally right in front of your face. Like I probably will never, ever touch a Cézanne drawing. So how has that affected you?
Well, I was thinking about that the other day, and I think seeing them on a table on my work table in the studio, conservation studio, they're completely stripped naked, so to speak. Like they're without the fancy whatever mounting and the frame, and they're not in the sacred gallery. I suppose that has made an impact, or has given me like maybe a different perspective. They're not suddenly, many of them doesn't really stand out as so holy, just so to speak. They become more of a material object than highly praised piece of art. But of course, I mean, looking at the Scream, for instance, or the Scream, I mean, there are many. I mean, there are two paintings and there are two pastels, and then but the paintings, they're also on cardboard. I don't know if you didn't know that,
I did not know that.
Right. So there was a big robbery when the Scream from the museum got stolen, and some years later they retrieved it, and it had this water dam, or this it had like a tide line, a diagonal tide line across one of the corners. Yeah, because of the cardboard, and some sort of fluid had made this mark. But even though it was the Scream laying in front of me, and I was supposed to have a look at, what can we do? Like, do you have any brilliant solutions? Like, how can we solve this problem? What do we do with this tide line? Even though it's a Scream, it just becomes the piece of material in front of me. Like, I think, that's quite interesting though. I've never really thought about that in that way before we speak about it now. But it's actually, it has something to do with the context, and then, after a while, of course, it got back into a new frame, and it was up on the wall, and I see all these tourists kind of admiring it, and it's actually one of the most depicted. It's even more depicted than the Mona Lisa. The Scream is one of the most reproduced motifs. I suppose it would be that it's maybe a little bit. It kind of takes the edge maybe off, like it takes the whole big saga of the particular piece. But also it can also go the other way, and when I'm thinking about it now, because when looking closely on something, or examining things through a microscope and really see how things are made, this is one of my completely nerdy things that I just keep doing, like analyzing all the time. But sometimes an object that maybe did not have, or wasn't so prestigious for me, suddenly became very admirable because of how it was made and the skill behind making it. Things that you may not see when you're looking through glass, or maybe there's a distance between even the artwork and where the public can stand looking at it.
Yeah, and having that access, like the first time I ever saw a Dali painting in person, it was very small. And because of that, you had to get close to it. And it was, I don't know, maybe like this 6 by 6 or 9 by 9 inches. And it blew me away because it was meticulously painted in a way that I didn't understand when I saw it as an image on a computer, or I think I'd seen a poster of that image before. And I had a whole new appreciation for the craft of that, and we're, as potters, we're into that. Like that,
yes.
A lot of the discussions that we talk about on this podcast are about execution. It's about the execution of skill, and then transcending that skill into meaning through repetition. So let's shift into the clay conversation. You mentioned you were burnt out in clay and glass school. Like the study of it was taxing to you. But now when I see your clay work, it's so relaxed. So like, how did you get back to clay?
Well, I think it was always kind of there. even if I started working with conservation. I've been through I've rented space in so many different constellations, like public studios, shared spaces. I've even been through places where we had like a little shop upstairs, and then there were like 3 studio spaces downstairs, so like different cooperatives and things like this. And I always felt like I was missing something. I mean, when I was doing work 100% full time at a museum as conservator, I was really not happy, because even though, I mean, conservation can be creative in the sense of, or from the aspect that you're actually, well, you're problem solving all the time, but being creative and create, it was just kind of missing, from my life. Yeah, I just got stronger and stronger, that feeling that I was really missing something. And so when I finally got my own studio at my home, yeah, I couldn't stop making. Then it was more about the time, like, putting in work, selling my time for the museum, but then kind of owning my time back home and just kind of making again, but in longer periods or blocks of times. I mean, that's when things start to happen. Like, you need these blocks of times, otherwise you can't really, or this is how I felt it, like otherwise I can't really push things forward, right? Because it's a whole process. And yeah, we all know that the ceramic process is time consuming, and there's so much time from starting an idea to see the finished project, and then maybe tweak it a little bit or change things and then remake it, and then it's this whole thing you just have to plunge into and just kind of keep going. And if you dissect that time too much, you kind of just lose track a little bit, I think.
Well, before we get into the images that you put on the pots, I wanted to talk about the throwing. It's this beautiful, soft throwing.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, dip things and slip. It's like right up my alley. It's all the things I love about clay.
Yeah.
So can you talk about being attracted to a sense of clarity in the throwing, but also a sense of relaxation in the way the object looks after it's thrown?
I had this period when I was very, very fascinated about the traditional craft, like traditional Scandinavian slip trail pottery. I was reading, trying to find all this information about the old potters and from the 1700s, 1600s, 1800s, and looking at pots. This is also something that I kind of got a little bit more acquainted with when I was doing my apprenticeship at that museum I was talking about, when I was discovering paper conservation, because they had a really nice collection of old 1700, 1800 pots. But the type of pots that's not, just kind of domestic ware, things that people had in their house, not necessarily posh, fancy things from a wealthy family or royal family or whatever, but, the everyday used objects. And I remember specifically this one pot where there was kind of like an indent from a finger, like a finger mark. And my finger fit perfectly into that mark. And I was thinking, wow, I'm holding this pot. My thumb fits perfectly into someone else's fingerprint. But this is like 200 years old. Like someone, I just felt this connection with that maker. And the thing with the traditional pots and pottery is that everything is just so, everything has a purpose. The pot looks like it looks for a reason, like everything is there for a reason. The lip is specifically designed to take on some sort of wrapping to store things. And there will be like a little waist where you can tie your little string around the jar to, everything has a purpose. The whole design. And I just thought that was really interesting. And so the whole fascination for earthenware, clay, I think came with that. I think with these types of pots, there's almost always a very like some sort of imperfection that gives them so much life. Yeah, I mean, in the 1800s, they were maybe quite fast thrown, and they will be the same, have sort of the similar shape and have the same use, but they are always individual, and you can see it so well. And I just find that very intriguing, like this very visual connection between the maker and the object. Yeah, and when I started looking at other potters, I don't know if you know about the Goldmac Gallery in England.
Oh, I do. Yeah, they make amazing videos.
Yes. There's a French potter, and I should know the name.
Nicholas Gerard.
Yes, Nicolas Gerard. Yeah. And when I saw his work, I was just blown away, because it's very playful and very kind of rough in a way. It's not very, but it's just so very well balanced and spontaneous, Yeah, I was always very intrigued by that.
I have a funny story about that guy. I discovered his work independent of him. Like I was in Jingdezhen and looking through a kiln building of a studio, and no one was there, but I saw his pots, like those big square platters that have his drawings,
Yeah.
and they're very immediate. Like it looked like he takes a nail or something to scratch into that surface. But I couldn't figure out who to tell me who made them. And because everything around was very refined porcelain, and then there was just that. And I was like, what? This is amazing. And it had the qualities we're talking about. Like, it is intentional but casual, and that balance is so beautiful in the work. It's so immediate and fresh.
Yes, definitely. Completely stoked by that. It's I have a few of his pieces. Yeah, no, the softness of the clay. I don't know. I was just kind of used to working with the earthenware, and I'm a very tactile person. It's funny. I was listening to your interview with Sarah Pike the other day, and you guys were kind of talking about the feeling. You were talking about the feeling and the touch. With my own work, I think about that a lot. How does it feel to pick it up? How does it feel to hold in my hands? Is it comfortable to use it? How does it feel to put it against my lips? How is the bottom of the cup feel in my hand? There's something about that tactile quality that I want to kind of transfer to whoever's going to use it. I want it to be comfortable to use. I don't want it to be a fancy pot that sits somewhere alone on a shelf. I want it to be used. That's when I'm happy. So I think there's I think it's probably a bit of both those things, like my own tactile sense or whatever, and also materials that I was used to working with in a way.
I noticed on your website that you described it as higher firing earthenware. What's the temperature you fire to?
11. Oh yeah, see, here we go. So in Celsius, hold on, 1120, 1130 degrees Celsius. So what's that?
So that's, I think, in our cone 5 or cone 6 range.
Right. Yeah. It gets, I mean, the clay I'm using is, it can be a pain in the butt, but because it contains a lot of manganese that gives it the dark color. But it's a very, very fine clay. There's no grog, and it gets almost kind of like a porcelainous ring to it once it's fired. So it gets kind of dense, but very fine in a way. When I'm working with that clay, I usually use a lot of like wooden tools, because I find it, very compatible with it brings out the softness in the clay, or it speaks with the softness, or to the softness. Like it matches the softness of the clay. It makes soft marks, and yeah, I think maybe my favorite tool is the wooden rib. That makes the nice lines in soft clay.
If we contrast that desire to, leave the clay feeling as fresh and soft as it is on the wheel after it's fired, and then you start decorating it, like the decoration is so crisp because everything or a lot of the things are decorated with decals. So can you talk about how you balance that between like the softness and the freshness of the clay and the tightness and often mathematically driven patterns that you'll put on pots?
Yeah, I think in my mind, I'm trying to keep my decoration, like I try to make it clean, kind of minimal in a way, but I try to adapt it to the form and the shape of the cup as much as I can, because there is something with decoration that, decoration kind of almost always overrides the form of an object. Decoration is usually what catches your eye first, and it can sometimes hide a bad form, a badly shaped object, or it can enhance it, And so I try to think about these things when I place my patterns or photographies or whatever, collage or what I'm making. I think when I use full patterns, I had this project when I was photographing Japanese fabrics. And so I extracted kind of like the main parts of Japanese fabric patterns and then transferred them to clay. But it was all this kind of connection between, like the softness of the clay and the softness of the fabric. But what changes when you just put a few elements of the fabric grain or the pattern on a hard surface. But usually those patterns are very kind of clean and simple. Like it will be like a repetitive pattern of one small unit or element that will repeat. So in that sense, I'm hoping that it doesn't scream too loud,
The first pots I saw of yours were around when you came over to Florida years ago. I first saw pots that were tight, repetitious pattern. And then when I was looking through either your Instagram or website or somewhere, around that same time, I saw something that was totally different, which was photographic images in which space, like there was so much negative space around those images. So it was almost like you're working in two different veins, something that is a repeated pattern that compresses space, not a lot of negative space on the pot. And then others where you might have a figure, like I was looking through your shop, there's some like discotheque roller skater guys, which some are just a portrait, but then some you've put animal heads on top of the roller skating guy. But then there's all this negative space around. So it's a very different way to think about imagery on a pot. So can you talk more about when you're putting photos of people onto the pots or collages that involve photos of people?
Yeah, collage is also so interesting, I think, because it's just the idea of so many of the images that I'm using is my own photographs, and of course, if disco roller skaters from the 70s are not, but so there's a mix. But like all the animals, and I can tell you where I met them and blah blah blah. But I just find it so interesting if you have a photography or an image, but then you just kind of extrapolates you take out one element, and just like with the art that I'm conserving, there's the scream and it's fancy and historic and whatnot. But then when you have it on the table without the context, it's something completely different. And suddenly it almost, you changed the meaning of this object. And the same thing happens with photography or imagery when you take out an element and put it together with something else. Again, I don't know, it's kind of slightly it's not minimalistic, but it's, as you say, there's a lot of space where the pot show. And I think it's the balance between where I'm trying, maybe unconscious, I don't know, but trying to balance that, way between decoration and the shape and the form of the object, so that the decoration doesn't necessarily overwrites the shape of the object, but and also there's so much to see in a surface that has been dipped in slip with, when you have like a dark clay that fires through, and you have like drips and things that suddenly become other things. It might become a cloud, or rain over a water or something like that. Like you can suddenly turn these accidental little things in your clay surface into new things, like by putting elements or pieces of imagery next to them. I just find that very fascinating.
Yeah, and there's a surreal quality in the way you're doing collage. Like you'll put an animal head on a human body, but then there are also some that are they just look like straight photographs that you've taken that you put onto the pot. There was one I wanted to reference that was in, I don't know if it's in your shop, but it was essentially, it referenced a poem by Juan Moreau. You're essentially sitting back from two people, but you're looking at them 100 feet away from you. They're smaller figures. They look like they're looking out at the ocean or at the top of a building or something. But there's something there's so much solitude in that picture of two people that it felt like you're displaying a human relationship. And it goes beyond like making something funny and cute, and it goes into like, we're looking in on these people's lives. Do you know which piece I'm talking about?
I'm not really sure. Is it a cup, or is it a larger piece?
It's a cup. It's called You Belong. But, even not in reference to that specific piece, I'm just interested to hear you talk about how, like, some of these pots become serious, like serious topics of like, I'm going to show someone's relationship. And then on the other hand, some of them are completely silly. Like it might be giraffes that are, sort of mix and match to become a pattern. And it seems like you're approaching the art of decoration in two different ways. So do you think about it differently?
No, I don't think. Well, I think it just kind of reflects, I guess, my personality. There's the quiet guy in the philosophical corner, and then there's the guy who just want to, make funny, quirky things. It's I guess it's that you're seeing. I like the idea of putting photographs in orders, or to create a little series, like a little story on the object that the user then, of course, can just kind of infuse with their own interpretations, and they can connect their own stories to what they're seeing. And I like the idea of someone picking up that pot. It feels good in their hands, and they can the story might change, throughout the year, or throughout a lifetime, I don't know, or the day even, or, whoever picks it up, it will be a different story. But yeah, and I'm interested in people generally, like people, I connect with people. This is something that drives me forward and gives me energy. People's stories and cultures and people. It's a thing.
This is a great segue, actually, because the thing I wanted to end talking about is your travels. You're Swedish, you live in Norway, you're getting ready to live in Berlin for a year. It seems like that traveling and being immersed in other languages and other cultures is something that feeds you. So can you talk about that, and how taking these residencies in other countries has been helpful for your career and also your art practice?
There is something with the travels and other cultures that is just, it's always been there. Like this kind of, as long as I can remember, I've had this kind of curiosity about other countries and cultures and people. I remember sitting in front of the TV as a kid, and I saw this person working as a cell painter at Disney World or something like that. I was like, yeah, I could do that. And it was just always in my mind. And I think also working as a conservator, and it's also a very international profession. And there's a small community, but it's scattered all over, the globe. And so I always felt kind of like a global citizen, really. I mean, here in Europe and Scandinavia, everything is so close, everything is so small. Like if I go on the plane for 50 minutes, I'll be in Stockholm. And if I go from Stockholm 50 minutes by plane south, I'll be in Copenhagen and in Denmark, and everything is just very well connected. For sure, it has affected my work, both culturally, but also like craft wise, seeing other traditional craft and talking to people about their craft. And it's just made borders shrink or go away completely. I don't know. I have a network of friends all over. I mean, nowadays also people moving out. I have friends in Berlin that lived there for a long time. I have friends in Australia. I have friends all over. It feels like these days, and it's so easy to stay connected via social media. And I don't know. I was always very fascinated about culture and different ways of living. Maybe it's something I identified with as a kid, to being maybe a little bit odd, and just kind of looking for or seeking other ways of living, or like realizing that there's so many different ways of living your life. And I don't know, I've just always, when I was 17, I applied for some work in London for like a Finnish airliner. I didn't get it, but it's just so natural. I never thought about that I shouldn't or couldn't, or I've always been seeking for things, or like looking for things. I don't know.
This residency in Berlin, is this going to be all clay? Like, will you be able to devote your time solely to clay, or will you be working on paper as well to help fund all of that?
No, my goal is definitely to focus only on clay and maybe imagery, photography. As I told you before we started recording, I don't really have any more jobs. I just finished a 6 weeks project for one of the art museums here in Norway. But after this, I have no more bookings the rest of the years, and I've really worked hard and so long to make space for a continuous slab of time that I can really dive into more. I feel like this is what I need. I really need to kind of dive deep into the clay. And I have so many projects that I can't even, there's like a long list of things that I wanted to try, but I never got around to it. When you divide your time, so I'm 100% freelance. So I go to museums, or I take on jobs whenever I can or get the opportunity. And then I try to spend time in my studio. And it's become really frustrating over the years because of finances. This is a classical issue. You have to get that money. But then again, if you don't dedicate your time to your making, you won't be able to make a living out of your making. And it's this whole evil circle. No, but it's hard to snap out of it. But things have really changed for me during the pandemic, and my work situation is different. My private life has changed, and actually at the moment I don't really have a permanent place to stay. I don't even have a post address. So it's a bit daunting, but it's very exciting as well, because it's this whole empty horizon to take on. I just actually cancelled. I was supposed to do like a contemporary ceramics market thing in Dresden, a city in Germany, in the beginning of September. But I just felt like, so I'm starting the residency in the beginning of August. And so it's just,
that'd have been
it would
tight
be
to
too
try
distracted.
to pull that off.
Yes. So I just, canceled it. So I'm really trying to prioritize and make space to not push things either. I don't want to get there and then feel that I need to start to make things, on day one. I want to have the time to just kind of land in Berlin, feel that I'm there, just kind of, take in the city, the art scene, and just kind of let my curiosity be my guide. I think that's when good things will happen. So I've been working really hard. I'm so used to just kind of planning ahead all the time, with the freelance life. You do a project there, you do a project there, and then, but now I'm trying to do things a little bit different. So yeah, it'll be interesting.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing how the work that will come out of that down the road. To wrap up, can you plug your website and also social media so people could get in touch if they want to?
Sure. You can find me on Instagram. My handle is d.gillberg, and that's Gillbert. And my website is just my name, DanielGillberg.com. And if you want to shoot me an email, that's hello@danielgillberg.com. Anytime.
Well, thanks. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, well, thank you for reaching out and for catching up.
I'd like to thank Daniel for coming on the show. I met him years ago, and it was nice to connect across the pond via Zoom. Before we go, I wanted to thank today's sponsor, the Michiana Pottery Tour. They are happy to be back in person for their 10th annual tour, which is happening September the 25th and 26th in northern Indiana and southern Michigan. If you'd like to find a list of participating potters, you can do that at michianapotterytour.com. You can also follow them on Instagram under the same name. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.